r/AskReddit. Doctors who have been in an "is anybody here a doctor" situation. What happened? My friend has had it happen twice to him. Both heart related in restaurants. Was able to use a defibrillator to save one's life and the other unfortunately passed. Defibrillators don't work if the heart is completely stopped, and CPR is a long shot and didn't work in this case. What is it about restaurants? I witnessed someone legitimately choking in a restaurant years ago. A friend with me used to provide first aid training including CPR and hemorrhage. 5 seconds after the lady's daughter screamed for help, a guy was already trying the hemorrhage. My friend was by his side and talking him through it, since he wasn't trained, just a good Samaritan. It seemed like it took forever for EMS to arrive. They took the choking lady out to the ambulance and stayed in the parking lot for several minutes. I took this to be a bad sign. Was told later the food was far enough down that it had to be surgically removed. The lady didn't survive. Not chewing enough, talking as they're eating, suckling air in, means big chunks of food get sucked into the windpipe and lodge there. My mom has had to respond twice on flights when someone was in distress. The first time was in the air and a guy was having a diabetic low. She monitored him until we landed. The second time was sitting on the tarmac when a guy had a stroke. They delayed the flight and took the dude off the plane. She also said that after the first one, the airline sent her a thank you card and said please use these enclosed vouchers to get tickets to a destination of your choosing, but they forgot to include the vouchers. She said she thought it would be rude to write back and say hey you forgot the vouchers. I was across the aisle from a guy who had a diabetic low, although I didn't know it at the time. He was non-responsive and having little seizures. I thought he was a goner. When the volunteer doctor came over I helped him lay the guy down in the aisle and take his blood pressure. This is really not that easy in an airplane aisle with a non-responsive man. So the flight attendant broke out the emergency medical kit. I was very impressed amount of advanced stuff in this bag. It seemed like they have a little of everything in that bag. So this doctor quickly, it almost seemed like he knew his way around one of the kits, found a little plastic tube and opened it up. He told me it was glucose. All he did was rub a little on his lips and the guy started coming around. I was stunned. Pretty soon he just got back up in his seat and seemed in pretty good shape. Of course they had a medical crew waiting to help him off at our destination. My wife is a doctor. She passed out on a plane trip and we had to see if there were any other doctors. Well, don't leave us hanging, were there? No. She's still passed out on that plane. Some say they are still looking for another doctor to this day. My father, doctor, 30 years ago was sent to work in southern Italy, although he already lived with my mother in the north, and a large part of the salary ended up in tickets to return by plane every weekend. The fact is that during the flight to the south, lasting about 1 hour, they do not give anything to eat, except they pass with a trolley to give candies. Needless to say, the classic situation of the old woman who chokes on it and cannot breathe. My dad was called, and with a few heavy blows on the back he managed to get the candy out of the poor old woman. A week goes by and the day of the return on the plane comes. The trolley with the candies passes promptly, and out of nowhere a girl sitting in front of my father who was trying to get one is blocked by her friend. Don't take it. Last week they told me that an old woman got choked up, and to free her a doctor had to slap her really hard on the back. I like the thought of an Italian flight where everyone panics, but they find a doctor, and he assesses the situation very carefully, and he chooses not to use a Heimlich maneuver, but instead of that, professionally elects to slap her on the back, but like really hard. I'm a nurse. We are taught to do 5 hard back slaps before moving on to abdominal thrusts. While we were on our descent, somebody lurched over in their chair and became unresponsive, tachycardic, and diaphoretic. The whole episode lasted for about 2 minutes. Then he woke up and vomited. I figured he had an arrhythmia and recommended he not take his connecting flight to Cleveland and instead go to the ER. EMS was waiting on the ground and helped him off the plane. I actually saw him again on my return flight home. He told me he was diagnosed with an arrhythmia and made an appointment to see a cardiologist in our hometown. This is somewhat frequent time for arrhythmias to present. I don't fly very often, but I've seen 3, maybe 4 of this type of thing on a flight. I'm not a doctor, but I'm going on the symptoms you mentioned. It was probably just a coincidence that it happened during descent. Happened in an airplane. Me, as a 4th grade medical student, and my professor at an airplane for going to a medical congress in our country. A man 50-ish years old lost his consciousness. We got there before the cabin crew yelled the situation. Had to do CPR for 25 minutes until we had landed at an airport for emergency landing. We still had a 1.5 hour away, and we also landed off with him to make him reach hospital safely. It was a rural military airport. Airplane waited us to return. Took a 40 minutes later after we landed, got to our destination. In return flight, we were upgraded to business class and taken from our hotel by a private chauffeur. 25 minutes of CPR. You must have been exhausted afterwards. Even 5 straight minutes on a dummy, and I was telling the dummy he wasn't going to make it. You are awesome. We were 2 people and turned in every 2 minutes. I would be giving breathes and my professor would be on compression or vice versa. In minute 15, we got a shockable rhythm, so we gave some shock also. At ambulance, he had a regular heartbeat. It was nuts. I'm currently a first-year resident internal medicine in Sweden. This happened last year, about a year after I graduated, so I was still relatively fresh out of med school. I was flying home from my vacation from the Mediterranean, or 3-hour flight, when they announced on the speaker system that they were looking for a healthcare professional. Stood up when they called out a second time, maybe 15 seconds later. It was me and a bit older nurse who went up to the front rows, where a middle-aged male was awake but unresponsive. As I didn't really have a lot of experience and was somewhat panicking, kept the panic internally to myself. It's scary being alone. I fell back to ATLS and eventually noticed that I had a D problem, decreased strength in one of his arms and one-sided facial droop that was quite mild. Long story short, I suspected a stroke, but couldn't really do a whole lot. We were 30 minutes away from landing at the time of the initial call. They didn't deviate or anything. I didn't feel like I did that much, to be honest, except say that I suspected a stroke and asked if they could call an ambulance to the airport. The airplane seemed to land a bit faster than it usually does, and as we went off the runway, there was an ambulance waiting off the taxiway. When the ambulance staff boarded the plane, I gave a short report and that's basically it. I got a thank you from the relatives and the stewardesses. They asked me to write down my name and email, but I haven't heard anything since. I used to work as a flight attendant, and thank you for making yourself known. It's always a support, no matter how little you feel you've done. We just get the basic training, depending on the airline a little more or less, so it was always a godsend to me. Even when nothing happened, I always appreciated when doctors made themselves known during boarding. Our airline even has a doctor on board program where you enroll, show up on the passenger list, and earn some miles. And eternal gratitude from the flight attendants, haha. As for stroke, my basic training taught me that there's not really much you can do on board except for a diversion/immediate landing. Since you were that close to the next airport, there was indeed not much you could do, but I'm sure the crew appreciated you being there. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. Just yesterday morning, I heard these women screaming in the hallway of my hotel, "We need help. Does anyone know CPR?" I ran out the door and told these women I was a nurse. They took me to the front lobby, where they found a young woman who seemed to have overdosed. She wasn't breathing, but she had a pulse at first. It started to get weaker then stopped altogether. I had to do 4 rounds of CPR before I felt a pulse again, and it was right as the EMTs were walking in. I work in nursing homes, and most people are DNRS. I've never had to do CPR on anybody. It's crazy, that was my first time, and it was at a hotel, and not even work. I was flying out of my home airport during my intern year. I had just finished my cardiology rotation, intensive care. The flight attendant asked for a doctor because a passenger had severe chest pain. It turned out there was also my senior resident and my CCU attending on the same flight, unknown to me. All three of us had worked together for the past 2 months and signed off the CCU the day before. Like a well-oiled machine, we took care of the patient. He was stable, thankfully. An ambulance was waiting for him when we landed. And I was very grateful to have both my senior resident and my attending at the time. Recently, before the coronavirus, I was taking an international flight. The flight attendant asked on if there was a doctor aboard. I was actually asleep, but somehow that woke me up. And I was like, wait, you need a doctor? Turns out a patient was experiencing some diffuse chest pain. Went to examine him, and minor alarm bells rang when I asked him some questions. I had a very high suspicion that this guy was having an aortic dissection. I told the flight attendant, who passed on the information to the pilot. The pilot made an emergency landing at a different airport, met with an ambulance. I later called the hospital to find out what exactly it was, and turns out I was right. If they had carried on, he might not have survived. Not in the medical profession, but from my time in the military, I knew basic life-saving techniques like CPR and what to do when someone is drowning. My story involved my son when he was 6 years old. We were in town for my father's funeral. That night at the hotel, the kids were in the pool. It was packed. He was swimming in the shallow end. Next thing I know, a girl is holding him saying, "I think he's drowning." I pulled him from the pool, asked if he could breathe. He shook his head no. I laid him down, rolled him to his side and hit his back. He started throwing up lungfuls of water. Finally he says he can breathe. My wife is freaking out, and he is white as a ghost. He threw up probably 4 to 5 times. Worst part is, when I pulled him from the pool, my first thought is I'm gonna watch him die. My wife said I reacted so fast that I had H out of the pool before she realized what was happening. I almost lost my composure when he looked at me and said, "Thanks for saving me, Dad. I recommend, if you can, to take some basic life savings classes." Super lucky that the girl noticed. Used to be a lifeguard, and it's super difficult to spot people drowning when the pool is busy and loud. Drowning people don't make much of a racket. They just slip away. I warn parents to keep an eye on their own kids in the pool, even if you think they can swim and there is a lifeguard on duty. Happy fun can turn to sorrow pretty damn quickly, and kids often overestimate their ability. I have a doctorate, but I'm not a medical doctor. But shortly after receiving my doctorate, I was on a transatlantic flight, and the flight attendant came around asking if any one of us was a doctor. I very briefly considered answering jokingly, yes, but not that kind of doctor, but the man in front of me said that he was, and as he was leaving with the attendant, he said to his wife, "I've been waiting my whole career for this." About 15 minutes later he came back, slightly disgruntled. Turned out a woman in first class was having a panic attack, and she ended up with 3 doctors around her, all frustrated that they didn't get to do an emergency tracheotomy at 35,000 feet. This woman has trouble breathing. We need to perform an emergency tracheotomy stat. But I'm feeling fine now. Really, there is no trouble at all. Don't you ruin this for me. Listen, I'm a doctor. I know what I'm doing. Now, does anyone have a sharp knife? A pen would also do the trick. I'm getting so excited. Not a doctor, but I was on a flight from DC to Chicago and got so sick I passed out upon landing. As I was coming to, I was being aided by a man and heard another person shout, "Are you a doctor?" The man helping me replied, "I'm the Surgeon General of the United States." This was Vivek Murthy, and it happened around 2015. He was the kindest and humblest guy. Are you a doctor? I am, doctor. Not a doctor, but the patient in this scenario. I was on a long flight, 4 hours, and developed excruciating pain and urge to urinate. Holed up in a washroom for about 20 minutes, when a flight attendant inquired if I was okay. Explained the problem, and they got on the PA system inquiring about a doctor on the flight. The doctor, correctly, suggested I was suffering from previously undiagnosed kidney stones. They passed a 2-liter bottle of water into the washroom and suggested I drink as much as possible. While I didn't pass the stones, the water flushed my kidneys enough to make the balance of the flight bearable. I sought medical attention upon arrival at my destination. I just had a kidney stone about a month ago. In the safety of my own home, it was terrifying. I can't imagine what I'd have done if I was on a plane. Phew. That pain is something else. Not a doctor, but I'm CPR certified. I work at a gym and a guy passed out after coming out of the shower and people started shouting for someone to help him or find a doctor. Being a stupid teenager, I was too nervous to do CPR. I was scared if I made the situation worse, or what if he didn't need it? So, yeah, I probably should have done more. A few moments later an actual doctor came in. I remember he was naked and looked like Thor. The passed out guy woke up just as Dr. Thor came in though and wanted to leave, but Dr. Thor convinced him to sit down and rest a bit because something had happened to his blood pressure. When your heart's getting tired and weak and you're collapsing towards death, all it takes is one sight of naked Dr. Thor and bam. Your heart is pounding and pumping again, rearing to go.